In this episode of the Planners Podcast, I'm joined by Liam Conneally, who is Chief Executive of Galway County Council and also Chair of the County and City Management Association's Planning and Land Use Committee.
And remember, planners make recommendations for decision makers to make decisions. Those of us who are fortunate enough to transition into that decision-making space will realise the importance in making a decision, that you're aware of who is the recipient of that decision.
Liam is a qualified planner and he became Chief Executive of Galway County Council in 2023, the first local authority Chief Executive to come from the planning profession. We talk about Liam's journey from planning into senior local government leadership and the role of planning within local authorities and the opportunities and pressures facing a county as diverse as Galway. Our conversation touches on planning reform, infrastructure delivery, public trust and what implementing the Planning and Development Act 2024 looks like in practice. Liam, thanks a million for joining me on the podcast.
Delighted to be here.
Can you tell me a bit about your own background first, where you studied and how you found your way into local government? And then we can talk about why we're talking to you, I guess, and how you found your way into planning and then worked your way up through the ranks.
I'm originally from Ennistimon in County Clare. I'm one of 5 children, Elizabeth and Willie Conneally. I come from a small farm outside the town, probably closest to idyllic in terms of an upbringing. Loved everything rural, I suppose. Also went to Ennistimon CBS for primary and secondary school. Went from there to what was NIHE Limerick. I think 1989 we were the first UL graduates. Did a degree in public administration and national and regional planning, which was fantastic. Brian Callan from Shannon Development was one of our main lecturers once we specialised after a year or two. I think, my love of planning and all matters planning, Andreas Faludi, Chris Daller and all those theories, I suppose just resonated with me. I have to say that seed that was sown in college in Limerick then blossomed when I did the MSc in Town and Country Planning in Queen's University in Belfast. Graduated there in 1991. And I would say, I suppose, just a complete opposite, Sean, to today's employment environment of the 24 of us that did the diploma in town planning and the MSc in town planning. I would say 2 out of 24 would have stayed in Ireland on temporary 6-month contracts. A lot of my friends from college are still abroad. Some stayed in planning, others moved on to different careers. So that was my background. I was very lucky in the way that I grew up and the people that formed me as a person and my career. I also have a big love of the GAA. Would have played for obviously all those different institutions, played Sigerson Cup, managed to end up in a winning team for Queen's in 1990, loved it, and still have fantastic friends. After that then, played a bit of football for Clare and managed to be on that 92 football panel that beat Kerry, and we know about all the cows in Clare that weren't milked and all of that. And my son plays hurling and is involved with the Clare hurling setup. So it's nice to see the continuation and the love of sport and the importance of sport and the way it forms us.
It's great to have you on because you're one of a small but growing band of local authority chief executives who started off as planners or who maybe, do you still consider yourself a planner? We could maybe explore that.
Delighted to have been the first local government chief executive in Ireland that came from the planning profession because, historically, engineers, architects, accountants, different professions would have come through naturally. And just took us a little bit longer, but it's great that I think there's 4 or 5 chief executives in the local government system now that have planning backgrounds. That's really healthy.
How difficult or how different is stepping up from that sort of senior professional, senior planner role to a a very senior management director service role, and then into a chief executive role. What is that like moving from it?
Really important question. And look, honestly, I can't stress enough, from the planning profession point of view, you're always doing the pitch, whether it's a plan, whether it's a public realm project, whether it's an application that you're dealing with, whatever it is, you're front and center. Honestly, I think the big transition for me was learning how to listen and learning how to value other inputs into either information gathering or decision making. To take the planning hat off, it isn't natural, I suppose, when you're so invested in the profession, but it was a discipline I learned, and it stood me in really good stead, because the fundamentals and how I arrived at a decision. And remember, planners make recommendations for decision makers to make decisions. And those of us who are fortunate enough to transition into that decision-making space will realize the importance in making a decision, that you're aware of who is the recipient of that decision. And, it's a cliche, but insofar as you can, to understand the impact of that decision, that for me, and the gravity of the decision. And we all make decisions in our different lives every day, many of them. But when you're in the public service area, the importance of making decisions in an informed and impactful way, for me, was really important. And I go back to my comment earlier about the importance of listening and taking all that information on board, looking for the quiet voice in the room, and just understanding the importance of whether it's a funding piece at director of service or chief executive level, whether it's a project prioritization, whether it's a planning decision. It really is nice that in a complex planning decision-making space, how easy it is to navigate your way through a planning file. That's valuable. I have to say, I was in the chief executive post. I'm in it since April of 2023, so just over 3 years. One of my first big decisions was the Dexcom plant at Athenry. We managed in that instance to front load the pre-planning element of that, bring all the different disciplines in the council into the pre-planning space, inform the applicant and the agents for the applicant of the ask in terms of the different components of their application. And when it came in, we were in a position to grant it within the first 2 months of the application. Okay, it was intensive in the pre-planning stage, but you can see what Red Tree and other processes are trying to do in terms of that space, eliminate the needs for further information, front load and put the onus back on the agents and applicants to make sure that what comes in the first instance is decision makeable, if you know what I'm trying to get at. And really, for critical infrastructure and what government are trying to do in terms of housing provision, in terms of enabling infrastructure around the housing provision at scale, that is really important. That front loading of planning and environmental and other inputs, whether it be transportation, whether it be environmental impact, into the planning system, so that when it comes to the decision making within our system, that we can do it efficiently.
If we zoom in on Galway then, in your role there a bit more, can you set the scene, I guess, and for people who aren't maybe familiar with Galway County and the scale and the mix of places and the Gaeltachts and the environment and the towns and the communities and all that, can you just kind of paint a picture of the sort of issues and pressures and opportunities that are there in Galway?
The scale of the county, it's my 8th local authority to work in. It's the biggest in geographic terms. Like, with a population of nearly 200,000, is a considerable local government in its own right. 39 elected members, 5 municipal districts, a revenue budget of 205 million, capital budget of about the same. So a really big spender in the local economy, to bring that amount of spend into the local economy that's a considerable economic impact. I have to say, I've worked in, as I say, a number of other authorities. Galway is a really progressive place. And I think the people of Galway and their elected representatives think progressively. And that has made my job so much more enjoyable and so much, I don't know if you could call a chief executive post easy, but certainly easier. So from that perspective, I'm very fortunate. So the 5 municipal districts, insofar as we can, we push decision-making into those municipal district meeting spaces because it is, what's relevant to Ballinasloe or Tuam or Loughrea-Gort isn't relevant to Clifton or might be directly relevant to Clifton. So their needs are different, their local economies are different, their infrastructure needs might be very similar. Obviously, what's relevant in one area in terms of priorities might be a priority in the other areas. So that decision-making at that municipal district level is really important from part eights and indeed approvals of different projects. That's important. We have, as you said, the Gaeltacht areas, and the linguistic and the cultural piece in Galway is really important. I think it's what differentiates us. It's a unique selling point for Galway. How we care for, in particular, the spoken language. Because we know in Galway that in our county and also in Galway City, over 50% of the daily Irish speakers live in our jurisdictions. And, that's really important. The 3 Aran Islands, I try and visit as often as I can. And then obviously the other inhabited island is Inishbofin. Beautiful places, wonderful people. Again, I get back to that attitude in Galway, the self-help. We'll get it done.
What is a typical day or week of a local authority chief executive like now? Or is there a typical day or week?
I suppose part of the attraction of the job is, there is no typical day. From hour to hour and day to day, you can anticipate all you want, but there are things you won't anticipate and that you have to deal with. So it's the job is complex. It's complex in many different aspects. I suppose where you're dealing with people in terms of, just the expectations of people. We provide over 1,000 services to the people of Galway. And sometimes it's not understood that we don't have enough resources to provide everybody with the service level that they want at a given time. So just managing that expectation. I suppose the other piece, the internal staff in Galway County Council, just again, really positive, ambitious organisation that runs because people care about what they do and they own what they do. Again, rather than kind of leaning on this cliche public service value. But if that wasn't there, well, then the job would be so much more difficult, especially for the management team and me as the leader of that management team. So our senior teams, from our SEOs, senior engineers, senior planner, down through the organisation, that appreciation of what we're trying to do. And I suppose the corporate plan, our 5-year work plan, from a Galway County perspective, I was really anxious that staff in the directorates, the elected members, and our SPCs and our CPG, the strategic policy committees that we have, the 6, and our corporate policy group, that they were all front and centre in terms of their involvement in the preparation of the plan. So that sense of ownership comes from that. And then every year, we have our annual service delivery plan. So it's really structured. I think, planning background brings that kind of, that logic and that structure to organizational management from my perspective. And then having a really ambitious and capable management team is massive for me. And I put a lot of time into that space. And while we meet on a fortnightly basis to go through detail, the director of services themselves meet on a monthly basis to go through operational issues that don't necessarily have to come in to management team until they're at decision-making stage. It's an important kind of a sieving process, and it takes the more operational stuff out of management team then dealing with the strategic decision-making, plan-making, and other more critical work that any management team needs to be involved in. I suppose our relationship with our elected members, of the 39, there's 30 of the elected members in the controlling group, which is fantastic. But we really don't distinguish, as in, I meet the group leaders on a quarterly basis. Directors of service that are relevant to that agenda will join me in those. Members talk about the early morning meetings. We do a lot of that in Galway County Council. That continuous communication between us and the executive and the elected members, I think, gives the elected members assurance that the body of work that they've charged us to do and the funding in the budget they have provided us, that work is happening, and that there's confidence and capacity and capability in the organisation to make all of that happen. So I would say, even in the 3 years that I've been in Galway, our revenue budget has increased by nearly 50 million. And that wouldn't have happened but for the elected members have given me that vote of confidence. And that then translates into, that work agenda, a significant work agenda that the management team have. So there's your day-to-day piece. There's your week-to-week piece, Sean. And, it isn't rocket science, but it is hard work. It is public sector value. It is accountability. It's communication. It's transparency in terms of how we do it, and being fair to the municipal districts, because there are 5 big entities in their own right that constitute Galway County. So the fairness across each of those in terms of we distribute the funding and how we distribute the work that's done is important to me, because you grow up in a household, where in today's terms, 5 is a big family. Fairness was really important because that leveled the playing pitch. And my mother, God rest her soul, she was adamant. Nobody got preferred treatment. And in my own house, it's a very similar situation. And I take those values then into that work environment, because if people feel that somebody is being treated better or in a preferred way, it doesn't work well from either organisation management or it doesn't work well from a day-to-day operation perspective. If you don't treat your elected members equally, and that's really important, their mandate is to be respected. And if as a chief executive or any member of your management team, or indeed any member of the staff, don't have that as their core, well then the democracy that we have becomes even more fragile than it is. So for me, I'm pedantic about that. And that's very clear in any public discourse. And I speak, I have public engagements on a daily and a weekly basis. But the respect for the elected members and what they represent is hugely important for me.
Just from an organisational chart point of view, where does planning sit within the kind of directorships, and what's it in with, and how have you organised the planning department in the first place?
It's one of 6 directorates. Liam Hanrahan is our Director of Planning and Economic Development. So I've aligned planning with economic development and urban and rural regeneration. So I just think that they are really powerful functions that work well together. So, and more recently, and this is the engagement with the national piece, in 2022, the Ministerial Action Plan on Jobs in terms of planning and the planning function, that action plan, I think we're at about 220 additional posts since 2022 out of a commitment of 542, I think was in the plan. So that, for me, I suppose, puts, the priority that, I suppose, planning, economic development, urban and rural regeneration, like in terms of the organisation that is Galway County Council. So I'm about to put a second senior planner into our planning department. I just think that there's so much going on in that space, and I'm about to put a project management office into that space as well. Capital delivery for me in Galway County is really important. And if you don't have a project-driven office, I think that either the applications for those capital projects, the cultivation of communities and towns and rural areas where the projects are going, and those public engagement pieces to get acceptance of those projects, then the preparation of the funding applications for the department and department approval and the agreement and negotiation that goes with that. And then getting back into the either a Part 8, Part 10 planning application, or indeed an application in its own right, either through a designated activity company or through in-house team. And then the delivery of that project. The project management office is really important in terms of that. And then that PMO leans on the planning expertise. And I want to separate the development management piece and the forward planning piece such that there's interrelationship between it, but just that with Part 3 of the 2024 Act, the new Planning and Development Act commenced now, and the focus on the 10-year plans, that's going to warrant dedicated planning staff attention. So I don't want distraction there, because what you'll find is that, whenever there's pressure on the development management side or and the other parts of the, whether it's town teams or town centre first or urban and village renewal, or whether it's the different aspects of work that the planners are involved in. So our first round of 10-year plans, we're going to put a major effort into that space, because if we get that right, then I think we're good. We're in a strong position and an ambitious position for the decade to come.
And are those 10-year plans, do you think that's really the cornerstone of the 2024 Act, or are there other things in the 2024 Act that you're looking forward to getting stuck into?
The replacement of the local area plans, with the lower order plans, they will all speak and respect the city and county development plans, which in turn will speak to the regional, spatial and economic strategies and national planning framework. And the National Development Plan that aligns itself with the NPF is really important from my perspective, because funding has to flow to deliver the projects that are identified as the strategic projects in the county and city development plans. So for me, I see that policy-driven or planning-driven work agenda that is provided for in the 2024 Planning and Development Act as a real positive. And I think we should take full advantage of it. I think as well that we need to be clear on what's priority in terms of critical infrastructure, enabling infrastructure, to deliver on priorities for our communities, like the housing priority. It's not just central government priority, it's a priority for all of us. Because we see across all tenures of housing, the demand is huge. And if we're to grow in economic terms as we wish, in a very ambitious way, and I do see that continuing, well, then we need to make sure that other land uses such as housing, community spaces, public realm in town centre locations, and that community making place is really important in terms of objectives and in our county development plans, in our 10-year plans. We're going to pay particular attention to that, and we would see then funding opportunities that will flow once we have agreement of our elected members on what our priorities are in our county development plan in Galway, that we will then chase the funding opportunities that are there. And you talked about just opportunities. For us, I think in County Galway, they're very significant. We have towns of scale and rural towns of scale. And then we have the Galway metropolitan area. And then our city under Chief Executive Leonard Cleary and the working in partnership with the City Council, hugely important from my perspective. I'm sure he would mirror this from both our perspective. And that collaboration, working together, we're doing joint retail strategy for the metropolitan area. We're doing a joint economic strategy for city and county, and doing a considerable amount of liaison in terms of infrastructure priorities from utility perspective, water, wastewater, power, fibre, and all that goes with that. And the transport infrastructure enablement. Delighted to see, we're looking at this from a multi-modal perspective. We need active travel. We need public transport. We need the ring road as part of that. We need land uses to speak to transportation in terms of what the needs are, how we forward plan our places such that there's transport-oriented development opportunities, and how we forward plan greenfield sites such as Ardon, Garron, in east part of Galway City, right out to Athenry, in terms of that economic corridor that we have, that strategic economic corridor that we have in Galway. Massive opportunities from a planning perspective, huge demands, obviously. Can't wait for the National Planning Statement on rural housing. How that will speak to the needs of the Gaeltacht areas as well. In development management terms, I think we're hovering around the 90% in terms of our grant rate across all land uses, including the multiple unit housing developments as well as the one-offs. I suppose how we manage that and how we look after our language in Connemara, on the islands, in the Galway metropolitan area. We have Gaeltacht areas in that urban environment as well, and how we take care of them and make sure that we protect them.
Do you feel, and whether you're talking about infrastructure or, I suppose, housing targets or rural housing or renewables or a range of other things, language in the islands, do you think there's a good understanding of the needs of a county like Galway? You do get a feeling sometimes that stuff might just be an eastern perspective, and obviously there's an important role for the regions in that as well. But do you feel that more peripheral local authorities or more diverse local authorities or more rural local authorities are well understood in that kind of national policy making process? And, is it bringing up challenges for you?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, look, all I'd say to you is we don't feel that we're peripheral. In fact, we think we're the centre of what's going on. So from that point of view, Galway City and County has to act together as an urban area of scale, but also a massive rural area. Our elected members, we're very fortunate from a national representation point of view. We have a senior cabinet minister and 2 ministers of state that represents the Galway interests at cabinet level. And then we have Galway East, West, and like really strong elected representation from our Teachtadála and our senators. And so I believe that there's a clear understanding in government as to what our needs are. We mightn't be top of the priority list all the times in terms of receiving those transfers from central government, but there's a huge awareness, and we depend heavily on our elected members at national level to make sure that that priority funding that is required and those projects that we need and that enabling infrastructure across all the utilities that we require, that is front and centre in terms of an awareness at central government level. So I don't feel any peripherality or lack of communication on that at all. I do feel that from our systems and our governance system perspective, that we are becoming more efficient at decision making, especially around the critical infrastructure and the work that's going on with that accelerating infrastructure task force and the work that public expenditure and reform are doing, I think is really important. And I think it's one thing having, say, local government and central government aligned. And I think that that is happening and it's making us better and more efficient in terms of the use of public funds, and also maybe better at prioritizing critical infrastructure and what is critical. But I think the alignment of the utilities is hugely important from my perspective, because as a sector, local government in the current variation process on foot of government's Section 28 guidelines issued by Minister Brown last July, we're increasing the amount of residential zone land across the state by 50%. We're going from just under 10,000 hectares of residential zone land up to 15,100 odd hectares of residential zone land. That has to be serviced. And depending on the local authority that you're in, the amount of service land, of residential zone service land, will vary between 35, 40% up to 100%. Residential zone land in its own right, you can't build on it unless the services are there. In order for us to deliver on the housing, we need to make sure those utilities and those services. And it isn't just about that. It's about, yes, building units, but also we're building communities. And we need to make sure they are sustainable communities in terms of the quality of life for the people that will live in those communities, the public services that will be required to service those communities. So from my perspective, this isn't just about hectares of zoned land. It's about how do we activate that? And the role of the Housing Activation Office is going to be critical in that space.
There's a couple of threads that I want to bring together. And one is, you mentioned this and you spoke very passionately about the role of the elected member. You also alluded to maybe public trust and maybe attitudes to local government or government generally, maybe hardening or getting a little bit weaker and certain tensions there. I wanted to ask you about how you balance that proper planning and sustainable development, community building role with the need to deliver infrastructure, with also economic development and the competitiveness imperatives that are there. How do you want Galway, or how do you see Galway and local governments generally and the profession, being able to balance all those different things while at the same time maintaining public trust and confidence, working with communities, but also at the same time knowing there's going to be some difficult decisions that will have to be made.
Yeah, I mean, look, really important, the integrity of the planning system, the role of the regulator in that system is important. I would say, I suppose, from the point of view of the Irish planning system, probably one of the most open and transparent systems in the world. The amount of opportunity for first, second, and third party inputs to that system, it's obvious, it's evident, it's enshrined in legislation. So it's an open and transparent system. So from a public trust perspective, I think it's there. People have their inputs. They mightn't like the end decision, but they will have had their opportunity to have their say in that process. And so it's really important from a local government perspective, and I would say from a national government perspective as well, that there's an understanding that we can't deliver everything, and that we're moving to 10-year city and county development plans. So over that longer time period, the move from 6 to 10 years, the managing expectations for project delivery, whether it's critical infrastructure or whether it's more short-term infrastructure, I think we're going to have to, as chief executives, as management teams, we're going to have to manage those, as government, manage those expectations. And we're going to have to make the difficult decisions of what gets priority and make sure that the funding follows those priorities. Because if we don't, and if we don't deliver on what we say we're going to deliver in those 10-year plans, in those government statements, whether it be a national planning statement, whether it be a Section 28 guideline, whether it be a government statement of strategy, well, then that is what impacts public trust. And say what you do and say what you do again. And so from our perspective, I think we have to be, in government, we have to be clear on the fact that we can't do everything. There's a realization. These are our priorities, but we will deliver on those priorities.
And when it comes to that delivery piece, I wanted to ask, you mentioned the Ministerial Action Plan and Planning Resources. Is local government getting the people and the bodies and the expertise, I guess, that they need to do what they're being asked to do? And at the same time, how do you want to try and make sure that local government and Galway County Council is an attractive place for a planner to, start their career, build their career and work through their career?
The opportunities in the private sector for the planning profession are extensive. They're much greater now than they were in the past, and all I say is, and that's great. But can I say, Sean, we're more active now from a local government sector point of view in, I suppose, internships, apprenticeships, training in situ in terms of opportunities for staff in local government, to upskill themselves into the planning profession. That's really important from our perspective. So there's a bit of self-help there from our perspective as a sector. Being in on the milk run in terms of those those final year students at third level, encouraging people to do masters in planning. And again, how we can do that and make it easier for them. I think it's really important from a central government perspective that ministerial action plan on resources, that's followed through to its finish. As I said, 220 odd into a 542 uplift in terms of planning resources in our system. When you distribute those into 31 local authorities, and the amount of work that has to be done to make our system more efficient, to get decisions out in a comprehensive way, but quicker. And the adjustments that are happening in order for us to do that. Central government, in terms of the 2024 Planning and Development Act, that's serious heavy lifting. But the real test of that, Sean, will be in terms of its implementation on the ground. And we laud the policy-led and the forward planning-led piece in terms of how you invest in your communities and your local authority areas into the future. But the reality is we need the people and the professionals. And I'm talking about multidisciplinary professionals. The importance of having the ecologists feeding into the work of the planning profession, the architectural, the QS for us, really important in terms of we mightn't be able to afford it all, but what can we afford in terms of project delivery? So that's important for me from a budgetary point of view, because I need to keep that public trust. So we need to be able to be out there to tell them, well, this is what it's going to cost, but we can do 60% of this year. We can work this into a multi-annual project and then manage expectations in that open and transparent way. So as a country, hearing loads about, the amount of funds in our national coffers, the reality is we need to invest in our systems, which I think we're doing, and the people who run those systems. The national digital planning system that's being prepared at the moment is going to be end to end, from pre-planning right through to the enforcement activity in terms of the planning system. It's going through our Public Services Oversight Group at the moment in its business case terms. But as chair of the Planning and Land Use Committee of the County and City Managers Association, it's incumbent on me and us in the system to make sure that we get that right, that whatever replaces our iPlan and our APAS systems, that they're fit for purpose. So that digitalization of our service, really important. And then what's the role of AI, of artificial intelligence, in what we do? How do we use the bits that make us more efficient as planning authorities, as well as other roads authorities, as economic development enablers, etc. So I've asked my management team to identify the services in each directorates where we can deploy AI to assist us in delivering that service, so that any spare capacity or any savings in terms of personnel or financial resources, I can redeploy across the organisation. It's incumbent on me as chief executive to do that and to make sure that we get maximum bang for buck in terms of where the people in the organisation work.
That's really forward-looking, Liam. And then just one last question, which is, if we recorded this in 10 years' time or 11 years' time and you're at the end of your first 10-year development plan, what do you hope the people of Galway say that, the council achieved and got right over the period of that 10-year plan?
I hope in 10 years' time, we look at Galway as a growing city, an urban metropolitan area of scale, which is growing up in terms of densities, that it's preserved its uniqueness in terms of its culture and its people. We conserve the really important parts of the city, that in growth terms, that I, in the metropolitan area, make sure that in partnership with the city chief executive, that we build communities that are sustainable, that are serviced by public transport, whatever shape that may be, whether it be a Galway Lewis or whether it be cross-city bus connects, whether it be, ease of being able to cycle and to walk and, that kind of place that you want to live, because that's what Galway is. But I think a fundamental to all of that for us is that we take the heavy goods vehicles out of the city centre, that we build that ring road infrastructure that will give us the lung capacity to do all those good things that we know we can do. And I think that we make Galway the best place in Ireland to live and to work. So I think there's huge capacity to create really good legacy in terms of forward planning. I also would like to look back in 10 years' time and see, that Galway is a location of not just a global medtech or biomedical hub, but that we have microchip, we have data center capacity to facilitate our artificial intelligence needs, that we have renewable energy powering those centers, and that we have forward planned all of those essential utility requirements into our land use and transportation planning. So I think our vision is there, Sean, and I think that just doesn't come from me. It comes from the expectations of the people of Galway. It's represented in the council chambers by the people that they elect. They want us to be ambitious, and they want us to be forward-thinking, and they want us to be demanding of government. I would say the assistant secretaries and sec general in the Custom House probably see me more than they'd like, but that's going to continue. And that working relationship from local government towards the centre and trying to pull as many resources into Galway, that's going to continue. I would say having the planning background has been hugely powerful for me in terms of, that ability maybe to pull different strands of whether it be projects, small, medium, and large, funding proposals, ideas and visions together to put them into something that's understandable and implementable in terms of a plan. And I think there's a huge future for the profession. But I think it's crossed the acceptance of that multidisciplinary teams that planners will play really important parts in, I think is really important. And the fact we're doing the really nice stuff. I mean, when I started, it was development management from the start of the day to the finish. And that went on, from the early 90s right up to 2007 until, the economy had a serious crash in terms of development. I think that we certainly have learned that forward planning and preparing and the building blocks for our futures are really important if we're to make efficient use of public resources. And the 10-year plans in the new legislation, for me, are game changers in terms of time periods. I think it's important as well, Sean, that we realise that the ability for elected members to adjust where something isn't working, adjust policy, whether it be 2 years in, 4 years in, 6 years into a development plan, is really important. And that ability to step change where we need to, I think there's enough agility in the new legislation to allow those variations to happen when they need to. And I think that the planning profession will be central to informing and advising not just the management team in Galway County Council and me as Chief Executive, but our 39 elected members as well.
That's a great place to leave it. Thanks a million for joining me on the podcast.
You're very welcome, and thanks for asking me to do it. Slán.
If you would like to find out more about what we covered in this episode, you'll find notes, links, and more in the description area of this podcast. Do remember to press follow for our show so you'll get the next episode automatically, and remember to share it with a friend in the sector. Just tell them to search Irish Planning Institute on their podcast app. Our podcast today was produced by dustpod.io and brought to you by the Irish Planning Institute. From me, Sean O'Leary, thank you for listening.